Hello, my name is Benjamin Morris. I'll be moderating this debate on biofuels. And I will begin by giving some just basic background information regarding biofuels. Uh, Following that, Professor Ben Morris will argue for biofuels, and then Professor Benjamin Morris will argue against biofuels. So just to start, basic information, biofuels are split into two different types, biodiesel and ethanol. Biodiesel is made by combining alcohol, usually methanol, with fat, and it can be used to reduce carbon emissions of pre-existing fuel. So usually that's done by mixing 1 part biodiesel with 4 parts regular diesel. So 20% biodiesel, 80% regular diesel. Ethanol is produced differently. It's produced by fermenting biomass that is high in carbohydrates, and that is mixed with gasoline to create cleaner burning fuel. Usually it's 10 to 15% ethanol with 85 to 90% regular fuel. Recently, there's also been a development in flex fuel, which is up to 85% ethanol. And flex fuel vehicles are vehicles that can drive both regular fuel and drive using regular fuel and using flex fuel. The sources for ethanol, it's any plant-based material that is really high in carbohydrates. So the most common ones are corn, sorghum, barley, sugarcane, sugar beets, potato skins, rice, and soybeans. For biodiesel, the fats that are used are vegetable oils, fats, and greases, such as leftover fat from restaurants. The country that produces the most biofuel is the U.S. They produce 940,000 barrels per year, mostly from corn and soy plants. Brazil is second with 449,000 barrels produced per year. That's mostly because of the sugarcane that grows really well in Brazil. After Brazil and US, there's a significant drop off to Germany, which is the third highest, but they only produce 68,000 barrels per year. So the US and Brazil together combine to produce over 70% of the world's biofuels. So yeah, that's about it for basic information. So now I will turn the floor over to Professor Ben Morris, who will be arguing for biofuels. Thank you. As Dr. Morris said, I am Professor Ben Morris, and I will be arguing for biofuels. So the first major advantage of biofuels is they're both renewable and sustainable. Plants can be grown within the lifetime of human, which means they're a renewable energy source versus coal or fossil fuels, which, yes, technically regrow, but over the course of millions of years, so we can't consider that a renewable energy source. It is easy to grow many of the crops that are used for biofuels, and often you can use even food waste, and they're in fairly abundant supply. Additionally, because to grow crops, the crops take in carbon, biofuels are fairly carbon neutral, as the carbon emissions from burning them is offset by the carbon intake for growing them once you reach a cycle. One significant advantage of biofuels over some other potential energy sources for the future is the easier transition. It would be to switch to using them more than we currently do. Petroleum and other fossil fuels are used for countless everyday products, some that you would expect, like gasoline, but some that you wouldn't. Things like solvents, disinfectants, and medicines can be made with biofuels as well as regular fuels. So things that we rely on every day that we wouldn't necessarily think come from fossil fuels, but that actually do, we can switch over to using from biofuels. There are also already flex fuel vehicles in circulation in some countries. For example, in 2017, 76 of Brazil's small vehicle fleet was flex fuel vehicles. So they're already in circulation in some places. It would not be very difficult to just increasing the amount of flex fuel available, and then we could transition to a cleaner energy future. Biofuels are also often cheaper than regular fuel. You can see in this picture here, but that's not obviously the only case. E85 is normally cheaper than regular gas. Using biofuels would also help countries like the US achieve oil independence by net average in 2016, the U.S. imported 4.9 million barrels per day of oil. And that's taking into account the fact that we are exporting some too, but we're really importing almost 10 million. So because biofuels could reduce the need for oil, it would reduce the need for foreign oil. And that's, I think we all know, foreign oil has caused all sorts of problems in the last decade or so. And so by increasing the use of biofuels, we could reduce the reliance on other countries for our oil supply. And same goes for any other country that's a major importer of oil. Supply biofuels with the necessary the fuel for the fuel, effectively the biomatter that is used to create the biofuels. There is a need for more jobs in farming, and that can create agricultural jobs which don't require significant levels of education. So it could be a good way to help poorer people get jobs. There also are many future advances that can be made in the realm of biogas and biofuels. A major one that comes up a lot is algae. It's much more efficient to grow. Researchers have put that anywhere from 10 to 100 times more efficient per acre, algae than corn and the sugarcane and other crops that are used to create biofuels. There are new vertical growing models that recycle 85% of the water input. So it's not even as water inefficient as many would argue it might be. And the greenhouses for algae, to grow algae, can be put anywhere because they're not actually, the algae doesn't depend on soil. So you can grow them in places that are regularly inhospitable for growing crops. Another option is cellulose as the feedstock. So that would be a huge advancement because things like wood, crop residues, and grass could now be used to create biofuels, which means we're using, again, things that aren't part of the regular food supply, and that are extremely abundant and easy to grow, and those are being turned into fuel. Another huge advancement is small-scale options, and the one that comes to mind is a recent product called home biogas, in which you can take your food scraps and instead of throwing them out or putting them straight to the compost, put them in a little home biogas producer, and that can get you up to 2 hours of fuel per day. That's what their website advertises. And whatever byproducts remain is used as fertilizer and regular compost for your lawn. So there's all sorts of advances that are being made for the future and all sorts of reasons now why biofuels are such a great option. So now I'm going to turn it over to my counterpart, Professor Benjamin Morris, and he will try to tell you why I'm wrong. Thank you. Once again, my name is Professor Benjamin Morris, and I will be arguing against biofuels. And so while there are many reasons biofuels are a great energy source, this is well outlined by my counterpart, Ben, I think the cons really do outweigh the pros in this case. The first major argument with regards to biofuels is the food versus fuel argument. In 2016, 795 million people suffered from chronic undernourishment, as well as many others who may not have qualified for chronic malnourishment, but didn't get enough food. So how can we justify using our food to create fuel if people need it to eat? Additionally, increasing the demand for products like corn, rice, and other ones, soybeans, other things that are used to create biofuels, we're going to increase the demand for these products. And basic economics, increased demand means increased price if supply doesn't change. And so even with a slight change in supply, it would still be hard to combat raising of prices of food. Additionally, E85 is significantly less efficient than regular fuel. It gets about 15 to 27% less miles to the gallon than regular gas. E10 goes 4 to 5% less. E15 goes 4 to 5% less, and E10 goes 3 to 4% less. So even though these fuels cost a little less, you're still paying more per the mile because there's so much less dense with energy. It also, growing these crops requires resources. It requires land space, water, and so the things like water and land space are already fairly, I mean, put quotes on resources, but they're fairly limited resources in today's world. Additionally, we don't have that much remaining land space for agriculture. So if we need to increase the supply, and we do, otherwise prices are going to go up, as I just said, one of the big things that could result in this is reductions in biodiversity, which has its own many problems. Among them, not reductions in biodiversity, increases in deforestation, which has many problems. Among them, decreases in biodiversity. Another problem with biofuels is they would also most likely require GMOs, and that also decreases biodiversity. So there's another issue right there. There's also many challenges involved with growing the crops on the scale needed to make a significant dent in our fuel supply. So you need controlled conditions, notably temperature and humidity for algae, and suitable land and a suitable ecosystem for growing other crops like corn and sugarcane. That's why sugarcane is so effective in Brazil, but not in the US. Additionally, you would need to use fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, etc., all of which are known pollutants and have caused many environmental problems in the past. It's also a fairly untested energy source. There's no large-scale example of biofuels really replacing regular fuels. Even in Brazil, where a large percent of the fleet runs on flex fuel, many people don't actually buy the flex fuel. They just use regular fuel, but their cars happen to work as flex fuels. It's also still expensive, maybe not the the actual flex fuels, but to produce biofuels, there hasn't been enough research done to make it a truly cheap and efficient energy source. And I personally, because of all the other reasons I've outlined, don't believe it's the research should be going towards biofuels. It's really difficult to transport because that uses fossil fuels, and that's the next point. Fossil fuels are used in many of the steps to create biofuels, so they end up you end up in a carbon cycle. So ideally they're carbon neutral, but because of how much production costs, carbon costs are included in these processes, there is still a pretty significant carbon cost. But also it's hard to transport that much food, or when it's turned to fuel, all that fuel. So it really does need to stay in the country of origin, which Ben was trying to pass off as a plus. You get oil independence, and yes, that's great, but it also, for countries that can't necessarily grow enough crops, it would be hard for them to get the fuel they need. And I'm thinking, smaller countries with little agricultural space, things like that. So in conclusion, I think there are just too many major cons to make biofuels a reasonable energy source for the future. And now we will turn it over to the audience if they have any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ben Morris and Benjamin Morris, for that really entertaining and interesting debate about biofuels. My name is James Morris, and I did have a few questions that sort of naturally followed from your debate. So, and you wanted to know first what I knew at the beginning. I didn't know that much about biofuels. I knew something about ethanol, but I didn't know there was different types of biofuels, and I didn't even know that there was a controversy about biofuels. I thought it was all good, so it was interesting to hear some of the drawbacks of biofuels. But your debate did leave me with some questions. So first of all, I wanted to know, well, I did understand you said that ethanol could be the source of biofuels, and you talk about carbohydrates and fats. So I'm curious, when you use algae, what's the source of energy in algae that you're using? Is it the cell wall, or the cellulose, or the carbohydrate? What makes up most of the energy when you use algae? That was one of my questions. Let's see. Another question I had is, oh, you talked about the I think it was Professor Ben Morris talked about the advances that are coming, like using wood and algae and the like. And I wondered how far off are those advances? Are we talking 1 year, 10 years, 20 years? I had no idea. Oh, I know. I had another question. You mentioned E5, E10,
Oh, right.
E85, and I'm curious what those numbers actually mean. Actually, I'm even curious what does the letter mean?
Energy.
E stands for energy. Oh, okay,
Yes.
maybe.
No, I don't know.
And my final question is: if you have a flex fuel car, can it use regular gas, or does it only take biofuel gas? And that's me and Chester signing off.
Thank you, James, for those great questions. Seeing as they were mostly directed at me, I will answer them for you. So the first question you asked was about the source of energy for algae, and I'm glad you asked that. So some types of algae contain natural oils, and when these are distilled, um, it turns into you can turn it into a vegetable oil-like product or a petroleum-like product, which can be used as almost a direct replacement for gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel. So, which makes algae not just an efficient alternative, but also potentially a really useful alternative. Going to my first point of the ease of transition, algae can actually make that even easier. To the second question, which is the time frame for the advances, I really think it depends on how much research is put into biofuels in the next couple of years. So most likely, I'd say in the 10 to 15-year range. But again, it depends on how much money, how much time, and how much, again, research is put into biofuels. So that's up in the air for now because it depends. And there's always going to be more advancements down the line. So wood and algae and these aren't the end of research. There's always going to be more advances and more ways to make it a more efficient, cheaper energy alternative. As to the numbers and letters of E10 and 15 and 85, so the E just stands for ethanol. E10 is 10%, E15 is 15%. That's ethanol content. E85 flex fuel is a bit of an outlier. That actually means it's between 53 and 85% ethanol. So it's ethanol and then the percentage of ethanol. And that segues into the next question about flex fuel cars. What's great about flex fuel cars, and again, I'm glad you asked this question, flex fuel cars are just that. They can use regular fuel or flex fuel. So a car that's built to run on E85 can, if it's built as a flex fuel car, can also run on E10, E15, what you find at regular gas stations. So there's minimal harm in using these cars because they can switch back and forth with no problem. So yeah, thanks for asking those questions. I actually think that raised really good points.
Hello, professors. My name is Jossie, and I'm a high school student at BBNet. Recently, I did a research project and pitch on biofuels to my environmental studies class. I'm pro biofuels as a transition fuel, but I do not see them as an eternal solution, and this debate has emphasized this more for me. Professor Benjamin, I've been doing a project on food in my photography class, and I read that food waste is the single largest contributor to municipal landfills. So landfills are the third largest source of methane released into the atmosphere. This food waste amounts to about 130 billion pounds of food and $161 billion wasted in the US alone every year. Wouldn't using this food waste for biofuels be economically, environmentally, and socially favorable because we would be saving money, preventing methane from being released into the atmosphere, and we wouldn't be taking food from people who need it? Thanks.
Josie, I think you raised a great point, both of biofuel as a transitional fuel rather than a fuel source of the long future, but also that food waste is a huge issue, and food going to landfills has caused many problems. The problem I see is that we don't necessarily have the technology first to separate out the food waste from other trash, because often people just throw it all into one trash can, and also to convert such huge amounts of food waste into usable biofuels. So as Professor Ben was talking about with the home biogas, that only gives 2 hours of fuel per day, and those are fairly expensive. So to convert the single largest contributor to landfills, to convert all of that food into biogas we don't necessarily have the technology to do that. So it goes back to the question, yes, if we had that technology, it is the economically suitable thing to do, but we don't have that technology, and I'm not sure how close we are to getting that technology. So while in an ideal world, that's a great solution, I'm not convinced on how practical it might be. Thank you to the two kind audience members who asked these great questions, and to our two debaters for a great debate. I think everybody hopefully learned a lot, or at least was information that they already knew was re-solidified, and maybe your views did change. That's what the purpose of this was for. We will now close the floor both for future questions and for the responses by our debaters. So thanks for watching.